定していて、これ続けるでいいのかな。で、それぞれ40分用意されていて、それぞれのお話の後、質疑応答の時間を作っています。2種類の講演を用意したというところです。で、この企画っていうのは、例えば9月にパトロンプロジェクトの菊池舞子さんのお話を伺ったりとか、12月ですとかになると、今度は熊本市現代美術館の学園の、富田さんっていう方のお話をこれもオンラインでしたけども、お話を伺いました。で、今日は第3弾というか、上海と、ロンドンから、それぞれアート、もしくはアーティスト支援の実践をされている方々のお話を聞くということです。その大元といいますか、背景はこのプログラムの最初に書いてあるもので、ここにあるゆかり芸術の森という、それを、こんなものは存在してないんですけど、ゆかりの森って皆さん行ったことある方が何人かいると思いますけど、大学から10分ぐらい離れたところですね、車で。そこに、自然公園があって、そこでいろんな、家族で楽しめる空間があるんですけど、そこをなんとか企業ですとか、あとは民間の企業ですね、それからつくば市などの公共団体であるとか、で大学で、その辺がこう共同して、芸術を発信する場にできないかなっていう構想です。まだ私どもが頭の中で思い描いている内容なので、何でしょう、全く絵に描いただけのものなんですけど、少しばかり実現の可能性もあるので、今から用意したいと。そこを拠点に芸術、あるいはアーティストというものを支援する活動を発信していきたいということですね。そのための勉強会のようなものです、今日は。これまでの、ものも、ね、なんですけど、そのつもりで聞いていただければと思います。堅苦しいものではないので、気楽にお願いします。よろしいでしょうか。では、早速、最初の講演の、上海からですね、春アートギャラリーの、オーナーである春さんにお話しいただきたいと思います。タイトルはアジアから世界へコロナ禍のアートシーンの変遷についてです。まず春さんを紹介したいと思いますけども。
So, Andy and Beth, can you come forward? じゃあそれでは、続けまして講演2の方を始めさせていただきたいと思います。ちょっと時間が押してしまっているんですが、セッションを始める前にちょっとだけガイダンスといいますか案内をさせてください。フライヤーですとか、あと参加方法について事前連絡した際にも案内したんですけれども、こちらの、アンディ先生とベスさんのプレゼンテーションについてはすべて英語で行われます。で、プレゼンの後の Q&A のセッションでも直接英語で質問していただきたいんですが、直接そのお話、英語で質問するっていうことの、ハードルの高さを考えまして、ちょっと参加者に学生が多いので、なので、チャットボックスの方を有効活用していただければというふうに思っております。先ほど私の方から皆様に質問、コメントを自由に書き込んでくださいというふうに、投げかけたのですが、はい、こちらの方、プレゼンの間からどんどん書き込んでいただいて構いません。で、Q&A の際にそこから、講師のお二人に、ピックアップしてもらって答えていただくというような形式を取ろうかなというふうに思っております。もちろん直接聞いていただいても構わないんですけれども、はい、ちょっと質問のハードルを下げようかなということで、そういった形式を取ろうかなと思っております。質問のほか、あと思ったことですとか、感想のコメントですとか、何でも歓迎しますので、ぜひ積極的に書き込んで盛り上げていただければというふうに思います。はい。 私と面識のある学生何人かいると思うので、はい、ぜひコメント、質問書き込んでください。じゃあ、始める前にちょっとだけ、講師の先生のご紹介をしますと、お一人目がアンドリュー・アッシュ先生で、イギリスのユニバーシティ・カレッジ・ロンドンのインスティテュート・オブ・エデュケーション、教育学研究科とか研究所とか訳されるみたいなんですけれども、そこで美術教員の養成であったりとか、あと、博物館学を専攻する学生にも教えていたりっていうような方です。で、2人目のベスロイドさんなんですけれども、フリーランスファンデーションというところで教育キュレーターをなさっております。アートです。アート文化とかアーティスト、美術教育の発展を総合的にサポートするような、財団だっていうことなんですけれども、ちょうど仕事の内容ですとか、どんなことやってるかっていうようなことを紹介してくださる予定ですので、詳細はプレゼンの方で聞いていただければと思います。Okay, so shall we?
Okay, Kane, can you see that? Is that clear? That's a thumbs up from you then. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Kane. That's really helpful. Can I just say to everybody, thank you for inviting us to your seminar. It's really, we're really pleased that you've invited Beth and myself. And can I encourage you to use the chat? As Kane said, we're very happy to take questions or to respond to comments. So please use the chat box, and then we can have a look at answering some questions at the end for you and seeing if we can help clarify for you the sort of points and things that we're raising as we go along. So Beth and I have been collaborating together now for some years, working alongside each other in our different roles. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about my kind of, from a position of sort of ethnographically sort of thinking about this approach and locating, when we talk about collaboration, my experiences in terms of art practice over time. And Beth is going to talk about her role that she plays in the gallery as an educational curator. And we'll speak for about 20 minutes each. And then, as I said, there's time for some questions or some sort of discussion at the end. So please use the chat, as I said. Very kindly, Miss Minawa and Miss Hayashi have said they're trying to help and maybe sort of translate if there are any problems, or so don't feel conscious if you can't do it in English. Please do feel you know, that you can sort of still contribute and still participate. Okay, so as I said, I live in the UK, but I live and work in London and Brighton, and I teach at the University College London, and my studio is in Brighton, which is on the south coast of England. I mainly teach PGCE, art and design secondary, so that's kind of initial teacher education. If you want teacher training for artists who want to work in schools and colleges or in other kinds of cultural settings, but basically, you know, artists that want to use their practice as a way of learning and facilitating learning. I also teach on the MA in museums and galleries education, so you can see why I have an interest particularly in contemporary art and contemporary gallery work. And I teach on the MA as well, postgraduate, in sort of practice-based art teaching, along with some sort of Ed D work, again, all at UCL. And I think these kinds of strands are kind of interwoven. My practice as an artist, as a researcher, and a teacher, and a kind of sort of come together, I suppose, in sort of two sort of themes: art education, visual art practice as research and making. And then secondly, kind of transdisciplinarity, this kind of idea of collaboration, this idea of a dialogic approach in the practice. And my practice, I started as a kind of a sculptor. My first degree was in fine art sculpture, but I also use film, I use objects, I draw, I print, and usually work in kind of installations or sort of in situ contexts. And I'm going to show you some of my practice as we go through this presentation. I'm going to use my own work as a way of looking at the question of collaboration and thinking about what it means from my perspective and point of view. So I'll start with myself. As I said, my own identity sort of brings together different parts, synergizes together different parts: the artist, the researcher, and the teacher. And they all collaborate kind of within me to create the work that I make. So sort of collaboration for me as a theme resonates. So I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this. It kind of resonates personally in my own practice. It's kind of, kind of in my DNA, I suppose. And I've been influenced by many great artists who are artist teachers. People like John Baldessari. The example I've got on the screen now is a piece of John Baldessari's work, I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art, from 1971. And I really like the work of Baldessari, mainly because he's a conceptual artist like myself, and he looks at that relationship between making and learning. And another firm favorite is obviously Joseph Beuys, who advocates the importance of this relationship between making art, making meaning and meaning making, and making understanding, and thinking how that can be done through teaching. And he often talked about teaching as an art itself. And I really sort of kind of resonates with me when I think about how I position myself and how I understand what I do, and that in relationship to sort of collaboration. So I think I kind of play many roles as an artist, researcher, and as an educator. And I think these kind of come out in sort of different ways. So, as an educator, I sort of engage with learners primarily through discussion, an exchange of ideas and experiences. And so this is kind of what I would, what theoretically has been described as sort of co-construction, co-constructive notions of learning taking place, shared sort of dialogues, conversations that generate insight, knowledge, understanding. And I think as an artist, that kind of really resonates with me. So I see myself very much as a collaborator, as somebody who functions as a co-learner rather than a transmitter of kind of knowledge. It's a kind of a position that I take, that's important, that it's a two-way process for me, that I promote sort of experiential types of learning. I emphasize the opportunity of giving participants the opportunity to experiment with me, and in collaboration with me, in a kind of a supportive environment. And I think that's really kind of valuable, as it's important in the projects that I engage with. And then sometimes, there are tensions with this, obviously, and there are obviously sort of issues about control and process and my own practice and my own work. And I think, those are kind of things that you work through lots of dialogue and conversation. And I think also, as an artist, there's a responsibility of kind of modeling with learners, modeling within sort of a community, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I think, as an artist, I kind of think it's really important to embody critical and conceptual problem solving kinds of issues, or perhaps making and thinking how we perceive, what we perceive, and the different ways of engaging with participants. And I think as an artist, I think certainly as somebody that's a slightly more senior in years, I think I have a responsibility also to others that are new to their career and new in developing. And so I think I kind of play a role of engaging through my own practice and supporting and demonstrating that kind of critical and reflective and creative approach for other artists at different points in their sort of career and in their kind of trajectories. And I thought also finally kind of the social activist aspect sort of resonates with me as well. I think it's kind of responsibility to sort of think about and address social and political issues and cultural issues, and enable the participants to be able to articulate those kind of issues. And that's something that comes through a lot in the discussions and in the sort of work, and how, you know, how giving voice to participants and encouraging participants to broaden their critical and reflective thinking as part of some of the practice of my work. And then finally, as I said, there's this kind of aspect of, as a researcher, as an inquirer, the idea that, you know, I've developed these kinds of skills and knowledge through my own sort of education and through the sort of different sort of experiences, creative experiences, the making experiences, and the lived experiences. And I think it's quite interesting that there's been no sort of set career path that I've followed. I think it's been very much a kind of a relationship over time with individuals, with organizations, with sort of collaborations, with sort of community-based sort of aspects, as well as kind of institutionally based aspects. And I think all of this kind of practice sort of engages me in a process of inquiry. And so I've populated some of the slides with some of my work over time, and you'll see the change in some of the practice from some of the early stuff and through to some of the later stuff, which I think is kind of quite telling, you know, sort of when one looks back at what one has done and how one works, or how one sort of resonates. So there are a number of conceptual overviews of my practice and how I feel they support this notion of collaboration in my practice. And as a researcher, I kind of work hard to try to articulate my philosophical positions, or the lenses which I sort of see and how I frame things. So I've given you just kind of a quick overview for those of you that perhaps are interested academically in, you know, sort of some of the positions and some of the sort of points of reference. I've kind of listed for you some of the sort of key things there that I kind of use or act as kind of concepts to support. And certainly the concept of artful inquiry and visual art practice as research are sort of key models for me in terms of being generative, interested in raising sort of questions about personally situated knowledge production as a research strategy, the idea of crossing boundaries, you know, sort of interdisciplinary boundaries, the relationship with things like art, science, nature, education, walking. All of my exhibitions operate in kind of hosted spaces for display and for conversation. And I think that's really quite nice, because it functions as an opportunity to engage in, and thereby generating dialogue between artists, maybe scientists. I've worked a lot with neuroscientists. I've worked a lot with different sort of disciplines, and I also work with the learners, with my students, with visitors to the gallery, and I generate a kind of transdisciplinary kind of conversation. And so stuff, the example on the screen is my brain. I've mapped my own brain and used a MRI scan of my brain to sort of make my own brain in cold cast resin. And I think those kinds of thinking about ways of seeing and ways of being and conversations about self have really helped sort of in a cross-disciplinary kind of way. Yeah, and I suppose to conclude on this bit, I reflect on how collaborations help with knowledge production and how it generates multiple perspectives and in some ways unanticipated knowledge when one steps out of our own sorts of areas of familiarity or our own disciplines. And so I'm quite a big fan on that sort of those kinds of different types of ways of generating insights and understanding. And there are some key people and some key texts that I'll flag in a moment that are kind of snapshots about art making, about research, about the sort of meaningful relationships, particularly something like the Irwin texts that have helped me think about artistic inquiry and the discourse of research. texts that have helped me think about inquiry, theorizing sort of exhibitions and artistic and professional practice, and thinking about the scope of representations of language, symbols, objects, films, text, art, music, culture as artifacts, cultural sort of contemporary cultural artifacts. And these kind of processes of being able to help me sort of think about my approach, how to analyze, how to present or represent research, and a lot of those kind of Lapierre or Zimmerman or Mullen or Irwin or Eisner, all of those kind of art-based approaches allow me to collate ideas together as I create, transform, critique, promote shifts, all thinking through that sort of artful inquiry. Yeah, and Foucault, in terms of, has been really helpful in terms of French philosophy, as a thinking about as him being a philosopher, but also a historian, thinks about social theory, thinks about literature and critique, and some of his primary sort of theories that address that relationship between power and knowledge, and how they are used to form a social control through sort of institutions. That's been very helpful to sort of think and unpack. And then obviously some of the sort of more standard things like the Denson and Lincoln idea of a researcher being a bricoleur, somebody that brings together sort of different sorts of practice that don't fit neatly into one sort of paradigm. And I think that's kind of been sort of useful to sort of articulate those kind of interweaving of different viewpoints and bringing multiple perspectives together. And so, as I said, sort of, a key text, people that might be interested in thinking about theorizing their position, their relationship as an artist, as a researcher, as a teacher, and thinking about their sort of ways of thinking about visual arts as a means of representation for educational research. I think Rita Irwin's book, Artography, is a really nice go-to. It sort of helps think about our sort of the way that the sort of artist practice is primarily or complementary a practice as a form of inquiry, thinking about that kind of relationship between teaching, between learning, between practice and research. And I think it's a really useful text if people want to make sort of meaningful, sort of rich and meaningful relationships between some of these different elements. The Sullivans, again, is a really nice text if people are interested in thinking about, how that explores theme of contexts of artistic inquiry and positions and discourse within this kind of research. I think, again, it's really nice to sort of look at different methods of social sciences and think about systematic kinds of inquiries and ways of theorizing our art practice. So again, I think that's a really useful sort of text if people wanted to think about. It's quite standard sort of text here on Gillian Rose on visual methodologies. I'm sure most people have read this. It's a really kind of nice way of orientating your own approach and to think about interpreting visual culture, sort of thinking about the different sorts of ways that visual methodology is a field of kind of interdisciplinary and post-disciplinary practice can sort of start to be sort of unpacked and thought and considered, and how one can position oneself in that respect. And then the sort of last one, which is really good for sort of what we're talking about today, the idea of communities, the idea of collaboration. I think this is a really nice text by Etienne Wenger, and sometimes he writes with Lav, sometimes it's Lav and Wenger, and these are really kind of sort of key authors in that sort of field, theorists looking at that principle of coming together, the power of mutual support and engagement, and the sort of philosophical idea about the relationship between practice and the reason for sharing, and the importance of having a shared enterprise, engaging in mutual sorts of fields, related fields, and sharing, not just thinking, but maybe sometimes sharing resources, which kind of brings everybody along knowing. And so again, that's a kind of a nice key, I would say, a key thing to sort of text to sort of think about. So my own making and showing is really important to me and central to what I do, and it forms the basis of my understanding and my understanding as a teacher. I just a quick snapshot of some of the last few years, sort of local, national and international, and again, I think some of that's quite interesting in some of the collaborations that I've done and that I do. And please look at the website if you'd like to look at more of the artwork and the sort of things that I'm involved in. I am showing a piece next week in Tsukuba in the T+ gallery, and I'll mention this at the end of the presentation. I've got a series of films that I'm showing, a part of the campaign artists, campus artist in residency that Kane is running this year. So I'll very happily sort of talk a little bit about that if people want. So as I mentioned, I like to collaborate across disciplines, and I've worked with scientists, particularly in this case neuroscientists, and these images are of Professor Anil Seth from the Sussex University Sackler Centre for Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience, and I've kind of found that sort of dialogue and conversation really interesting, looking at that relationship between how we understand our brains and how we think about brains and knowing and perception and cognition, and the different relationships between science engagement and science sort of exploration, and then the sort of artist. And so what I've been thinking about here is very much those kind of questions about what can an artist with our situated knowledge and practice-based understandings contribute to the conversations that are happening in the world that are around knowledge and knowing and the brain. And so knowledge, for me, deriving from practice rather than from a written sort of sort of verbal proficiency and rather than a kind of a logical or sort of approach. I quite like situated knowledge systems, because they're not closed and they are not prescribed sets of rules or fixed delineations of content. They are practical rather than pragmatic. They are intensely sort of intensely practical, I suppose. They are sort of intended to respond in sophisticated ways to quite sort of different contexts, and unlike scientific knowledge, in which I suppose the effect of the observer is often to sort of think of things as problems. Many of the experiments are devised in order to minimize problems. I think situated knowledge helps us because it kind of gets the observer engaged, and it doesn't think of things in such sort of short-sighted. It kind of helps us kind of, I suppose, open out rather than narrow down issues. So these are some of the sorts of themes in my work. Some of the sort of recent things have been very much about embodied learning, about walking and making sense of spaces and relationships, and thinking about the relationship between some of the dislocations and some of the sorts of spaces, dislocations and places. Okay, so these kinds of I think so. In my day-to-day, what sort of collaborations make up my sort of reality? I think that's kind of a useful sort of maybe thing to think about. Well, as I mentioned, I teach at UCL, and so I work with a range of courses, and at the core of those philosophy is learning as, I suppose, constructivism. It's kind of Piaget, it's Vygotsky, it's the idea that knowledge is best when it's socially constructed. So we collaborate with our learners, and we work with a range of agencies on the courses to do that. There's lots of museums and galleries. There's lots of large ones like the Tate, the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert, ICA, right through to more small and local institutions like Camden Arts Centre, Peckham Platform, and Freelands, which we're going to sort of hear Beth talk a little bit about in a moment. And so as well as those kinds of teaching, I operate as an artist in a cooperative. My studio is based in Brighton, and I belong to something called the Red Herring Cooperative Studio. And that's important because as artists, we come together to share some of the responsibilities, to make ourselves stronger. It helps us to support ourselves financially. We take responsibility in terms of, running things and sharing things. So I think that's kind of a nice example of how the studio aspect can be collaborative and cooperative and works with partnerships. But I also, on a local scale, belong to something called the Brighton Artist Network. So I feel as a professional, it's important that perhaps we share and support others in the city in which I live. And so a way of doing that is networking and supporting the sort of local artist community. And I feel I have a responsibility to support some of the younger and developing artists. And we sort of use this network to sort of further professional develop, to help empower, to distribute sort of knowledge that we hold and that we know and that we can pass on. And I think that's kind of key, as so maybe offering advice, being a mentor, and supporting others. And for the last few years, 5 years, I've been working with the Freelance Gallery, and I've been working on an artist-teacher network, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And Beth will talk a little bit about the Freelance Gallery. But I think that's kind of important because I found the artist-teacher network as a way of kind of supporting professional development and sharing understanding with some of my alumni from the university, but also with others, to sort of develop a collaborative space for those kind of sharing moments. And again, as well as my exhibiting, I take part in residencies and gallery debates, which I think are kind of really helpful to locate practice in these different spaces. But also I belong to sort of professional bodies, national bodies, the National Society for Education, Art and Design, and international bodies. And it was through the international body of INSEA that I met Kane while I was exhibiting in Vancouver, that I made these kinds of connections with her university and with this community. So again, I think those kinds of professional bodies are key in terms of collaborating. And I started this is one of the early pieces I made, and my work's considerably changed. But the reason why I'm showing this is because I started first as an artist, working after I graduated on residencies, and I worked as an artist in industry. And again, I think that kind of practice of working in a foundry alongside sort of non-art people, alongside people who were building, casting huge pieces of industrial equipment. These kinds of conversations, the dialogues that were taking place while I was in that space making art, were kind of fundamental to the growth of how I understood myself as an artist. It was that relationship and that dialogue while I was making in these different sort of spaces that kind of convinced me to sort of develop that practice over time. And I've worked in a number of sort of educational institutions and residencies. There's a couple here: Cambridge University, more recently Tsukuba last year, and also some 10 years ago Reading University. And I think that kind of linking the talking and the learning, the context and the making has been really kind of helpful in forming my understanding, as well as kind of festivals. I've taken part in a number of kind of local and national festivals. Is bringing people together and thinking about culture has been really sort of informative. So I just want to focus a little bit for the last section on one project, because it links to what Beth would like to talk about afterwards. I just want to talk a little bit about the Artist Teacher Network, which is a collaboration that I instigated with the Freelance Gallery, but with also a range of artist teacher in London and now more nationally and internationally. So why did we set this up? I think it's an interesting sort of insight into sort of that question about collaboration. And I think I can dig down into this a little bit to sort of help with that sort of sense of you know, how things sort of generate, or some of the principles that perhaps guide this. So I've been working with the artist teacher philosophy for over 20 years in my teaching. But what was very evident is once the students had left some of the training and the work at the universities I was engaged in, their kind of engagement as artist teachers floundered a little bit, and they struggled to maintain that practice because of the relationship between their teaching and their learning and policy and practice in, you know, institutions, etc. And so I felt that that it would be timely to sort of think about supporting again this sort of practice, and the freelance was a really nice place to approach because we share similar aims, we share similar values in terms of developing artists and practice. They share this kind of as I do, this kind of need to think about underrepresented groups, to think about how one has how one can support things that normally don't get forefronted or normally don't sort of have funding or as much kind of attention. And so I think one of the first points I'd like to make about why is the need for having sort of shared values or shared understandings is a kind of a key to sort of starting collaborations. I'd worked with the freelance in the past, and so it was good that we could build on some of the things that we'd already stated. It was a part of an ongoing dialogue, which I think again is important. That the number of previous engagements and relationships and projects kind of led to this. And so often I think starting small can help you sort of develop into bigger, into better, into different, or whatever. But I think it's kind of important that that dialogue is established. So why would we want to continue with sort of a particular project like this? Well, I think that idea of that relationship between your personal development, your artistic development, and the idea of how that can have an impact on your effectiveness as a teacher, as an artist, but also on your learners and their creativity was something that we wanted to pursue. I think the idea, secondly, that there was a kind of a richness of working with contemporary fine art practice and galleries, and that the need for bringing together diverse thinking, the need for sort of bringing influences that could enhance our subject knowledge, that could enhance our understanding, and it also thinking about our own identities was kind of important so that we could have like a positive output or outcome. Thirdly, the partnership between galleries and museums and contemporary institutions brings some sort of prestige. I think that was kind of important as well. Working with a higher education institution, working with a gallery, kind of working in these kind of stimulating locations and contexts was really important to achieve the sort of ends. And it fostered, a kind of a culture, a community, which allowed us to access more. And I think, the idea that these things were based around the importance of sharing and mutual benefit was really kind of fundamental to this particular this particular project. And I think, again, I'll talk a little bit perhaps about power as well, because it was key from the beginning that this was something that was available for everybody. It was a community that everybody could contribute. So therefore, it needed to be quite diverse. It needed to be, able to be sort of collaborative in its nature from the beginning, in that we as a group were able to sort of co-design and co-construct the way that we operate, the way that what we do, the way that people are able to identify what is kind of important. So there's lots of consideration here about sort of listening and agreeing and learning from different practice and thinking about different practice. And I think that, there's motions where there will be clearly tensions in the making and in the education and in the relationships, but all these are kind of important in sort of coming to some sort of, well, I wouldn't say resolution, because I'm not sure that happens, but coming to, is part of that journey of how the community wants to talk, how it sees itself, how it wants to operate, and how it can kind of support each other. We have regular meetings. We have, as I say, a working party. We developed a working party that helps us to sort of intellectually and critically engage and share. Yeah, I think that's kind of enough about that. And Beth will pick up a little bit on some of these things, I'm sure. And so really, I mean, the sort of network sort of meets in the gallery space. Some of it's had to go online recently, but we experiment, we share. We show art. We invite people to the forum. It's over a year old now, and I think what's been interesting is the way that different participants choose to cooperate and show and present. It's been interesting to see how people have developed and changed practice through the engagement and working with others. There's been lots of conversations about how it's empowered people through the range of events like pop-up exhibitions, discussions, peer evaluations and peer sorts of presentations. We invite people to support as well, and there's a fair amount of wine consumed during the sort of sessions. There's a fair amount of alcohol and fun that comes along with that. But I think that's all part of the sort of part of the arena and the forum that's generated. Okay, so my conclusions. I think I've tried to put together some points here from the experience and think about that what we're reflecting on here today, which is collaboration. The idea of collaboration being about sort of a society sort of maybe that can change. There's a need for openness. There's this idea that I think we need to sort of maybe in our future now sort of approach things differently as the world's changing. I think it's important that for us as artists, as galleries, we start to respond to that change and start to think about how we can change some of our present practice. And I think collaboration is really important in terms of the social production and being able to sort of have that conversation with a range of different partners. I think the thing that's been key, the second thing that's been key in the things that I've done is the importance of transparency, the need for kind of shared values, the need to be able to sort of have discussions about what we're trying to achieve and how we're achieving that. And that builds up trust, that builds up integrity, that builds up the way that that you feel comfortable in being able to operate. I think the third thing that comes to me is that sharing, is the importance of giving up assets, a willingness to think differently about ownership and a willingness to perhaps to give and to share. I use the mantra that rising tide lifts all boats, and I think that's kind of been very important as an approach. I think the fourth thing that's key here is the idea of empowerment, the idea about, the distribution of knowledge and power, and therefore enabling people to buy in if they can co-construct and co-create rather than it being from a top down. It needs to be a ground up kind of process. It needs to be sort of inclusive. One of the key things that I think has really been important is the power of listening and looking at other participants' perspectives and being able to sort of talk through with others about different perspectives and different understandings. And the last point I would like to make is don't expect this to happen necessarily very quickly. It takes time. It's a long-term sort of to be successful. It takes it has to be a long-term kind of project, I suppose. And I would advise people to be patient. If you're going to develop something that's a meaningful collaboration, then there's lots of toing and froing, listening, developing common language, and thinking about then how we can the benefit helps everybody. I was going to end with just a quick analogy. As you can imagine, artists love metaphors and analogy, and I think I was going to link it to nature, and I was going to link to this idea of nature, because of relating to sort of the theme of the professor's idea and the project they're working on, and I was going to just sort of finish with this idea of a murmuration. A murmuration is is I live in Brighton, and these are pictures of the pier in Brighton, and this natural phenomenon of birds in the winter coming together as a large group. It's a really nice metaphor, a really nice kind of, as I say, concept of the power of individuals coming together. It happens every evening. It's a really nice natural phenomena. I won't play the video, but it sort of shows how small things coming together in large numbers can survive. It's really powerful, you know, the way that they support
Andy,
and protect.
Andy,
Yes.
quick conclusion, please.
Yes, okay, I've stopped. I just thought that was a nice sort of ending to sort of think about how coming together, in birds coming together would be a nice way of just stopping. Okay, so I'm going to stop now. And I'm going to hand over to Beth, who's just going to talk a little bit about her role.
Hello, I'm Beth. Lovely to meet you all. I'm just going to set up my share screen to share something with you. Just bear with me for 1 second. There you go. Can you see that, Andy?
Yes.
So hello, I'm Beth, and I am the education curator at Freelands Foundation. And just to say thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be speaking. Well, I'll say this morning, it's morning for us. But I will briefly talk about the following. I know I've only got 20 minutes. I'll talk about what Freelands Foundation is and our history, our main aims and examples of how we explore these aims. And I'm also going to discuss my role and a couple of projects and collaborations that I've worked on with different audiences that I think you might find interesting. I hope you find interesting. So Freelands Foundation was set up about 5 years ago. It's a charitable arts organisation that supports artists, cultural institutions and art education across the UK. We have a gallery space, a gallery/project space in Camden in North London. But at the moment, we're all working from home, obviously, because of the pandemic. Here we run exhibitions, we run events, we produce publications, we have awards, we do a lot of research, and we also run a lot of partnerships, and that's kind of how me and Andy work together. And also, as Andy's mentioned, we have a large, our whole thing is about art education as well. So everything that I've mentioned here is all around art education. And to say that this is a couple of exhibitions that we've had in the space. I haven't been to a gallery in a long time, it feels like, so it's nice to see one. We have 3 main aims as a foundation. So the first is advancing education and empowering teachers to enable everyone, regardless of background or location, to take part in the creation and enjoyment of art. Here's a couple of examples of things that we do with teachers, which I'll speak a little bit more about later. So here we've got a workshop that we ran. We have the Artist Teacher Network, and we have partnerships and publications. We run a big partnership with the IOE, where Andy works, and other PGCE teacher training programs across the UK. And as an education team, it's myself, head of education and creative director, we have a particular focus and interest on experimental approaches to art education. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. So our second aim of the foundation is supporting artists and art organisations across the UK to expand and reach in their communities. We do this via our funding arm of the foundation, which is called grants. Our current priorities is to support organisations across the UK, and then they can kind of create kind of art ecosystems in their own area, so that, you know, it's known that there's a huge art ecosystem in London, and as a foundation we're trying to grow this across the UK, so all these smaller organisations are better supported. These are a couple of examples of places that we are currently funding. Yeah, and it's all on our website as well, if you'd like to have a look at them. Another way we do this is kind of what I was talking about, these ecosystems, is we have the Freelance Artist Programme. It's a 5-year funded programme which we fund, and I think it's about 1.5 million to support 4 different institutions across the UK. So we have one in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland, one in the north of England in Sheffield, and one in Wales as well. So this is really about working with these spaces and growing these kind of art ecosystems. So this is a huge partnership that we run. The third thing is that we commission research which explores the value of art and culture today. One that we're quite well known for in the UK is our research into representation of female artists in the UK. A recent report really looked at the relationship between motherhood and being an artist, really, and how motherhood kind of plays alongside your career. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about my role as an education curator and focus on some particular projects and a couple of projects or partnerships that I've managed during my time at Freelance, and also talk to you about some of our different audiences. So here are our resources called An Introduction. These are quite traditional education resources for teachers that are all about our exhibitions at Freelance Foundation. They have an aim to kind of open up conversations, and I hope they're an aid for teachers to kind of continue the conversations within the classroom that they've had in the gallery or for experience the exhibition. These are kind of free to download on our website. And I think they're some of the first resources that I created for the gallery, and I'm trying to push what we do with our resources now. The second resource is called that I've really recently been producing because of the pandemic, is because of during lockdown we have to kind of move things online and create more online content. These are monthly videos on the Freelance Foundation that are at IGTV called Shift, which focus on kind of inspiring approaches and philosophies to art education. We have artists such as Harold Fay, who speaks about his approaches to collaboration. We've got artist teachers and we've got PhD researchers. And I hope that by people watching these and learning about different approaches, our audience will hopefully be inspired, and kind of it will impact their thinking and their personal approach towards their art education and something they do. It might be in their practice or something like that. So first to say that we're not actually that old as an organisation. We're only 5 years old, and we've had this gallery space or project space for about 3 years now coming up. We have done the more traditional things. So we have tours of schools and local community groups. We do art, we do workshops, and we run projects and events with university students. These are a couple. This is a photo of me giving a tour, and this is a poster from an event that I co-produced with some university students. They wanted a bit of experience in kind of running events and working with networks outside of their university network, really. One thing I wanted to talk to you about is that I formed a really good relationship with our local health centre, which is very near us in North London. It's in Kentish Town. Have you've been to London? They're neighbours. So Free Project Space, which is this arts centre within the health centre, we worked with a particular group called their Drawing with Aphasia group, and it was through conversations with the artistic director that we found out about this group, and we realised there was some connection and a synergy between some of the artists that we had in our current exhibition. So we worked with this group and we kind of gave them a tour of the exhibition, and we also talked about a lot of the artists that they had things in common with, and it was things to do with sleep and other kind of problems that they have because of what they've gone through. So we ended up creating these artworks inspired by Etel Adnan. But I'd say this is a very light touch way of working with someone. About a week after this, we had national lockdown last March, and I'm really looking forward to working with this group once we're able to be back in the space and see people in person as well. This was an exhibition called How to Meet, and it was a result of a series of workshops led by an artist open up to the local community. Every participant made a little cast on this ladder, so one of these little bits was made by each person. And this meant that when it came to an exhibition that their names were on the wall here, we saw these kind of non-artists as exhibiting artists in our space. The next project is we run annual school projects with putting an artist in a school. And it's something that I've really recently worked on. So this is a brand new school in South London, and I met the art teacher just before she was about to start here, just as she took the job. She personally was really interested in developing and promoting an eco-conscious curriculum, and an eco-conscious art curriculum in particular. And the school had already committed to things like not printing and being a paperless school. At the same time, we had an exhibition on, which was thinking about the ideas of community and sustainability. And myself and the art teacher saw real possibility for collaboration here in response to the exhibition. We put an open call out for an artist, and we selected Sean Roy Parker. The students actually helped us select him as well. And it was all about him being in the school and thinking about what sort of community they'd like to be. But the pandemic hit just as that happened, about a month in. So we ran a lot of online workshops, we sent parcels out. And then about October, when schools were back open for that short time in the UK, we ran workshops there. And we really thought about what sort of school they would like to be. So these are just a couple of photos from the project. Something that was produced was this zine. It's titled Towards an Eco-Responsive Curriculum, a Practical Guide for Artists and Teachers. So this kind of has advice and tips for artists and teachers, and includes a manifesto just here, written by the students, kind of thinking about what sort of school they would like to be as they grow, because they're the only students in this school at the moment, which is very rare. And we also produced this short film, What If the Environment Was Our Teacher? And it's all footage and audio recorded by the students, kind of reflecting on what sort of school they would like to be and questioning that as well. This is all viewable on the Freelance Foundation Instagram and website as well, which I'll show you a link at the end. But this is a lovely film, actually. I'm really happy with how this turned out. And yes, so speaking about the Artist Teacher Network that Andy briefly spoke about, and as he said, it kind of started through conversations with himself and Freelands and another art teacher who I think Andy taught on the PGCE, and thinking about how to continue those critical conversations. We've ran several sessions in the gallery. It's quite nice to see people in a space together. We're looking forward to that soon, hopefully. And we have kind of several different speakers, and we share work, and we run lots of different kind of activities to kind of help spark conversation and share ideas, really. And the real focus is to kind of critically think about the relationship between teaching art and being an artist. Here is an exhibition that I know Andy showed his work from it just before. It's Where We Work was a pop-up exhibition of photographs and text produced by the Artist Teacher Network, looking at the locations and where they created work. For some of them, this was their studio, as Andy showed. For some of them, this was their garden. For some, it was 5 minutes on the bus. That was their thinking time. And it was a really fascinating exhibition. So I'm just going to show you a couple of works from it. So we've got someone's playground, we've got someone's classroom, we've got the bus, and then we've got someone's desk at home. So there's a real mix in where people create their work and where they have their practice, really. And as we said, we've had to move things online. So we have been trying to figure out how we can still have these conversations and share ideas via Zoom. and it's been difficult, but I think we're getting there. But yeah, this was a great session that we ran last month. And I think now that, because we've actually gone online, the network's really grown. We've had huge demand. And I think now my role moving forward is to kind of think strategically about how we keep this network going once sessions can return to our space in North London, and how we can engage those who are all across the UK and in other countries to still kind of connect and collaborate with us. And that's something that I'm trying to think of really carefully and be sensitive around at the moment. So yes, as I said, I'm going to speak a little bit about my role as an education curator. I produce resources, as we said, these be paper or online, but yeah, mainly producing these kind of short films at the moment. I work very closely with our head of education and creative director on larger projects and the big partnerships like the project with IOE, and other PGCEs kind of across the UK, and also on exhibitions as well. I help run the Artist Teacher Network, and as I mentioned, I'm starting to try and think strategically about how we can kind of grow the network, but also make it connect everybody as well. It's really difficult with everybody in different locations. I spend a lot of time developing relationships with schools, teachers, local communities and artists. I spend a lot of time talking. I spent a lot of time on Zoom in the last few months, meeting new people and just learning about. I try and give people a lot of time to tell me what they're doing and things like that. I develop projects with schools, the Associate Artist Project that I briefly spoke about before. And I'm kind of constantly researching, and it's a big part of my role that I'm encouraged to do, is constantly thinking about exciting approaches and forward-thinking approaches towards art education. And something that myself and Andy thought might be quite interesting to mention is my job title sorry, that's just my doorbell gone. If you could hear it. My job title is education curator. In other organisations, I may be called a programmer or an officer or even a producer. Kind of through discussions, we decided that this job title as an education curator was a little bit of a statement in itself, because in other organisations, I may not be seen as a curator, but I'm doing very similar things that a curator would do. And it's that idea of giving education the same gravitas that an exhibition curator may have. And yeah, it's a little bit of a statement from us really, because we're all about education. And I'm happy to talk about that more as well. But I thought I should point it out, because I think it's there's not many places call their people in their education team curators. And yeah, and here's my contact details. So we've got the Freelance Foundation website. If you're interested in hearing more, all the things that I've talked about are on there. And then our Instagram as well, and my email if you'd like to drop me an email or anything like that. Thank you very much for listening. I will stop sharing screen, and I think we're going to have some questions. Yeah, so feel free to pop the questions in the chat or speak. Thanks.